They thought she was an easy target, just a woman driving alone on an empty highway, an easy hostage, an easy escape plan. But within hours of kidnapping her, fear shifted from her to them. Why? Because she wasn't who they thought she was. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The tables had turned and the hunters became the hunted. Have you ever underestimated someone and completely regretted it? Let me know in the comments below, because what she did next, no one saw it coming, not even them. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. Her name was Sarah. To most people, she seemed ordinary, a woman in her mid-30s, driving an old SUV down a dusty highway that stretched into nothingness. She wore simple clothes, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, sunglasses shielding sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked like any other traveler, minding her own business on an empty road. But beneath that calm surface was someone no one would dare mess with if they knew the truth. Then there were the three men, Jake, Mark, and Leo, gaped prisoners, desperate and dangerous. Jake was the leader, aggressive and cocky, the kind of guy who thought fear was a weapon. Mark followed Jake like a shadow, always looking over his shoulder, nerves frayed from the pressure of being on the run. Then there was Leo, silent, unpredictable, with a coldness in his eyes that said he'd done things you wouldn't want to imagine. The setting? A stretch of desolate highway cutting through the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where no one's around to hear you scream. Dry air, endless dirt roads, and a sun that made the asphalt shimmer like it was melting. A place where help was miles away, and danger could be hiding in plain sight. But here's the thing. They thought Sarah was the one in danger. They thought she was just a random woman, easy to control, easy to scare. And that was their first mistake. It all started with a screech of tires. Sarah was driving along that deserted highway, windows rolled down, the wind tugging gently at her hair. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the road when she noticed headlights in her rearview mirror, fast, aggressive, closing in. A rusty old van, dented and covered in dust, swerved recklessly, trying to overtake her. She kept her cool, her grip on the steering wheel steady. But then it happened. The van suddenly cut in front of her, forcing her SUV to a screeching halt on the gravel shoulder. Dust clouds billowed around her as three men jumped out, moving quickly, like they'd done this before. Jake led the charge, a wild grin plastered on his face, holding a crowbar like it was an extension of his anger. Mark followed, jittery and nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting cops to pop out of thin air. Leo was last, silent but intense, his cold eyes scanning Sarah like she was nothing more than a problem to solve. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't panic. She just watched. Jake yanked her door open, grabbing her by the arm. "Out! Now!" She stepped out without resistance, her face unreadable. Most people would have begged, cried, maybe tried to run. Not Sarah. She just stared at Jake, her eyes calm, almost bored. Jake didn't like that. He shoved her toward the van. "What's with the attitude, huh? You think you're better than us?" Sarah didn't answer. Mark muttered, "Maybe we should just take the car and leave her." But Jake shook his head. "Nah, we need a hostage. Insurance." They tied her hands with a dirty rope, tossed her into the back of the van, and sped off down the empty highway. Dust and fear filled the air, at least for them. Sarah remained silent, her face emotionless, her eyes observing everything. The way Jake's hands trembled slightly when he wasn't trying to act tough, how Mark kept fidgeting like he regretted every second of this, and how Leo's cold stare was hiding something darker. As the van rattled down the road, Jake kept running his mouth, trying to mask his fear with arrogance. "You should be scared right now. Most people would be." Sarah finally spoke, her voice low and steady. I'm not most people. Jake laughed, but there was an edge to it. Tough girl, huh? We'll see how long that lasts. Hours passed. They drove into the woods, far from any signs of life, eventually stopping near an abandoned cabin that looked like it had been forgotten by time. They dragged Sarah inside, tied her to a chair, and argued about what to do next. Mark was panicking. This was a bad idea, Jake. We should have just kept running. Jake snapped back. Relax, she's just some random woman. We'll figure it out. But Leo wasn't so sure. He kept staring at Sarah like he could sense something was off. And he was right. Sarah wasn't scared because she'd been in worse situations. Much worse. She wasn't just some random woman on a lonely road, but they didn't know that. Yet, as they argued, Sarah sat quietly, studying the room. An old, rusted nail sticking out of a floorboard caught her attention. She shifted slightly, positioning her tied hands closer to it without drawing attention. Jake eventually got in her face, trying to intimidate her. What's your deal, huh? Why aren't you crying? Sarah met his glare, her voice calm. Because you picked the wrong person, Jake snorted. Yeah? And who exactly are you? Sarah smiled faintly. You'll find out soon enough. Jake didn't like that answer. He slapped her, trying to get a reaction. But she didn't flinch. That rattled him more than if she had cried. Later that night, when the men were distracted, arguing about their next move, Sarah made her move. She rubbed the ropes against the sharp nail until they began to fray. She worked quickly, quietly, her expression as calm as ever. Then, in one swift motion, she broke free. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She attacked. Mark was the first to go down, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Sarah grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor and knocked him unconscious with one hit. Jake spun around, shocked. What the... But before he could react, Sarah was on him. She wasn't just fighting, she was calculated. She moved like someone who'd been trained for this exact situation. Jake was strong, but Sarah was smarter. She used his own weight against him, flipping him onto the floor and knocking the wind out of him. Leo tried to grab her from behind, but Sarah was faster. She elbowed him in the face, breaking his nose with a sickening crunch. Blood poured down his face as he stumbled back, dazed. In less than 5 minutes, all 3 men were on the ground, beaten, bruised, and terrified. Sarah stood over them, catching her breath, her calm demeanor never wavering. Jake groaned, clutching his ribs. "Who are you?" Sarah crouched down next to him, her face inches from his. "I'm the person you should have never messed with." She tied them up with their own ropes, using knots so tight they'd leave marks for days. Then she picked up one of their phones, dialing a number from memory. "This is Agent Sarah Blake," she said into the phone, her voice steady. "I've secured 3 fugitives, sending my location now." Jake's eyes widened. "Agent?" Sarah glanced at him, her expression cold. "Yeah, and you're going back to prison." The sun was just starting to rise when the sirens echoed faintly in the distance. But Sarah didn't wait for backup. She knew these men better than they knew themselves. Desperate people always had a backup plan. Jake was still groaning on the floor, blood trickling from his split lip. Mark was out cold, and Leo sat against the wall, his face bruised, watching Sarah with a look that had shifted from defiance to something else. Fear. But Jake wasn't done. Not yet. With a sudden burst of rage, he lunged at Sarah, breaking free from the poorly tied knots Mark had done in his panic. He tackled her to the ground, his hands wrapping around her neck, fury in his eyes. "You think you're better than me," Jake spat, tightening his grip. Sarah's face reddened, but her eyes remained steady, locked onto his. No panic, just focus. She reached down, grabbing a shard of glass from the broken window nearby, and with one swift move, she jabbed it into Jake's side. Not deep enough to kill, but enough to make him scream in agony and loosen his grip. She shoved him off, coughing as she scrambled to her feet. Jake was on the ground again, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. But even then, he glared at her like he still had the upper hand. "You think you're tough because you're some agent?" he hissed. "You're nothing. You hide behind that badge." Sarah stared down at him, wiping the blood from her lip, her breathing heavy but controlled. "This badge didn't save me," she said quietly. "I did." Leo, ever the opportunist, tried to make his move while Sarah was focused on Jake. He lunged, grabbing a rusty metal rod from the corner, swinging it with all his strength. But Sarah was faster. She ducked, the rod missing her by inches. She countered with a sharp elbow to his ribs, followed by a knee to his face. Leo crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. Jake was trying to crawl away, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. But Sarah grabbed him by the collar, yanking him back. "You think you're the predator?" she whispered, her voice like ice. "You're not. You never were." Jake spat blood, glaring up at her. "What makes you so special, huh?" Sarah leaned closer, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through him. "Because I've survived worse men than you." Just then, the door burst open. Armed officers flooded in, their guns drawn. They took one look at the scene. Jake, bleeding on the floor, Mark unconscious, Leo groaning, and Sarah standing there, steady as a rock. The lead officer lowered his weapon slightly, staring at Sarah in disbelief. "Agent Blake?" She gave a small nod, her face calm despite the chaos around her. "Took you long enough?" The officers moved quickly, cuffing the prisoners while Sarah stepped back, finally allowing herself a breath. But even as they dragged Jake past her, he kept his eyes locked on hers. "This isn't over," he snarled. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She'd already won. As the officers escorted the men outside, the lead officer approached her again. "You okay?" Sarah nodded slowly, glancing at her bruised knuckles. "I'm fine." But the truth was, she wasn't fine. Not completely. Because this wasn't just about 3 escaped prisoners. This was about proving something. To herself. She walked outside, the fresh morning air hitting her like a wave. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the dark night she'd just endured. But even as the sun rose, Sarah knew the shadows never fully disappeared. Jake's words echoed in her mind. This isn't over. And maybe it wasn't. But for now, it was enough. She watched as the police cars drove away, their lights flashing in the early morning haze. The noise faded, leaving only the sound of birds chirping, a strange, peaceful silence after a night filled with violence. Sarah stood there for a moment, her thoughts heavy, but her heart steady. Because sometimes, the toughest battles aren't the ones you fight with your fists. They're the ones you fight inside your own mind. Days passed, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She'd dealt with criminals before, escaped convicts, violent offenders, but Jake was different. His final words echoed in her mind. This isn't over. And it wasn't just a threat. It felt like a promise. She tried to push it aside, diving back into work, filing reports, meeting with her team, but the unease lingered, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Then it happened. Sarah received a package at her office. No return address, just her name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of her, taken just days ago, standing outside her apartment unaware she was being watched. On the back, a message was scrawled in red ink. "Told you, it's not over." Her heart raced, not with fear, but with adrenaline. This wasn't random. Jake had connections on the outside. She wasn't dealing with just an escaped convict anymore. She was up against something bigger. She dug into Jake's background, pulling files, making calls. That's when she found it. A link between Jake and a notorious criminal network she'd been chasing for years. This wasn't a coincidence. Jake wasn't just some thug who got lucky with a prison break. He was connected to the very people Sarah had spent her career trying to take down. Realizing the danger, Sarah set up surveillance around her apartment. But she knew that wouldn't be enough. She had to face this head-on. Late one night, her phone buzzed, a blocked number. She answered, her voice steady. "Sarah Blake." A familiar voice replied, cold and taunting. "Miss me?" It was Jake. "How are you making calls from prison?" she asked, her grip tightening around the phone. Jake chuckled. "You think bars can stop people like me? I've got friends everywhere." "What do you want?" "Oh, nothing much. Just wanted to remind you, you're not as safe as you think." The call ended, but the threat hung in the air like thick smoke. Sarah traced the call. It didn't come from the prison. It came from a location just a few blocks from her apartment. She didn't call for backup. She went alone, armed and ready. She arrived at an abandoned warehouse. The place was dark, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the empty halls. She moved quietly, her senses sharp, every muscle tense. Then she heard it, a faint laugh, echoing from the shadows. Jake stepped into the dim light, free, his smug grin wider than ever. "Told you I'd see you again," he sneered. "How did you get out?" she demanded, her weapon trained on him. "Did you really think I'd stay locked up?" "I was just biding my time," he replied. "But this isn't about me anymore. It's about you." Before she could react, more figures emerged from the darkness. Armed men, Jake's crew. Outnumbered but not outmatched, Sarah fought with everything she had. She moved like a storm, quick, precise, relentless. She took down one man, then another, but the numbers were against her. Jake grabbed her from behind, his arm tightening around her neck. "You think you're the hero in this story? You're not. You're just another target." But Sarah wasn't done. She elbowed him hard, breaking free, and turned the tables once again. A brutal fight followed, fists flying, adrenaline surging. It wasn't just about survival. It was personal. Finally, she had Jake pinned to the ground, breathing heavily, bruises on both of them. "You'll never win," he hissed. Sarah stared down at him, her voice cold and steady. "I already have." Backup arrived moments later, sirens wailing, officers flooding the warehouse. Jake and his crew were arrested, their operation dismantled. But for Sarah, the fight wasn't just about Jake. It was about facing the darkness within herself, the part that thrived on control, on being one step ahead. As she watched Jake being dragged away, defeated, she realized something. Sometimes, the biggest battles aren't with the enemy in front of you. They're with the demons inside you. The dust had settled, but Sarah's mind hadn't. Jake and his crew were behind bars, this time for good. Their operation was dismantled, their network exposed. On paper, it was a win. The kind of victory agents dream about. But it didn't feel like one. Not to Sarah. She sat alone in her small apartment, staring out the window at the city lights below. The noise of the world carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars honked, people laughed, sirens wailed in the distance. But inside her mind, it was quiet. Too quiet. Jake's words echoed again. "This isn't over." And maybe he was right. Not because he'd escape again, but because the battle wasn't just about him. It was about everything he represented. The darkness Sarah had been fighting her whole life. The criminals, the threats, the constant need to be stronger, faster, smarter. But the real enemy wasn't just out there. It was the one inside. Days turned into weeks. Sarah returned to work, her face as composed as ever, her reports flawless, her mission successful. But there was a shift, a shadow she couldn't shake, a part of her that kept asking the same question. What am I fighting for? She met with her superior one day, expecting the usual debrief. But instead he asked her something unexpected. Agent Blake, you've done more in the past year than most agents do in a career. What's driving you? Sarah hesitated. She could have said the usual. Justice, duty, the badge. But the words felt hollow. After a pause, she replied quietly, I don't know any more. Her superior nodded, as if he'd been expecting that answer. Sometimes the hardest part of this job isn't the missions. It's what's left when they're over. That stuck with her. A few days later, Sarah found herself back at the community center she used to volunteer at before her career consumed her life. It was just a small building, tucked between rundown apartments, but it was full of life. Kids laughing, volunteers bustling around, the smell of fresh paint and old books filling the air. She sat on a bench outside, watching the world go by. A little boy ran up, tripped, and fell hard on the pavement. He looked around, embarrassed, then met Sarah's eyes. She gave him a small nod, like a silent message. You're okay. Get up. And he did. That simple moment hit her harder than any mission she'd ever completed. It wasn't about winning battles. It was about what you do after, who you become when the fight is over. Sarah started volunteering regularly, teaching self-defense classes, mentoring young people who'd lost their way, not because she needed to prove anything, but because it felt right. One evening, as she was locking up the center, an old colleague from the agency showed up. You're hard to track down, he joked. Sarah smiled faintly. Maybe that's the point. He handed her an envelope. New assignment. Big one. They want you back. She took the envelope, stared at it for a moment, then set it aside. Not today, she said softly, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running toward the next fight. She was learning how to live without one. But she knew the darkness was still out there. It always would be. The difference was, she no longer needed to face it alone. As she walked home that night, the city lights felt different. Not brighter, not darker, just real. Like she was seeing them for the first time. Because sometimes, the biggest victories aren't the ones you read about in reports. They're the ones no one else sees. The quiet moments where you choose to be more than just a survivor. You choose to be whole. Sometimes, life's biggest battles aren't the ones fought with fists or weapons. They're the silent ones. The struggles you face when no one's watching. Sarah thought her greatest fight was against Jake and his crew. But in the end, it was the fight within herself that truly mattered. She realized something we often forget. Survival isn't the same as living. Winning isn't always about defeating someone else. Sometimes it's about defeating the parts of yourself that hold you back. Fear, doubt, regret. And here's a question for you. Have you ever faced a moment where you thought the battle was over, only to realize it had just begun inside you? Maybe it was after a tough breakup, losing a job, or overcoming a personal struggle. What helped you get through it? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If Sarah's story made you think, if it reminded you of your own strength, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the stories that stick with us aren't about heroes with superpowers. They're about ordinary people who choose to keep going when it's easier to give up. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next story. It might just be the one that changes how you see the world.